Hey everyone and welcome. We're not in my wormery right now. If you watched some of my older videos, then you'll recognize this container. This container is actually outdoors, and it's my outdoor worm bin because I was interested in trying one of these overwintering projects to see how the worms fare if they're left outside all winter. But I've got to be honest with you. Last night we were expecting temperatures down around 20, and a pretty cold day today, just barely breaching freezing temperatures and then going down to about 20 again tomorrow night or tonight. And if you back up a little bit, you'll see that we're not even outside anymore. I've actually chickened out and I took my bin into this old stairwell. It's kind of an abandoned stairwell that's been boxed in. Used to be the entrance into the upstairs apartment that I rent out, and there's a new entrance that's been created around the other side of the house. So this is just an kind of an old abandoned dead space that's sheltered from the elements outside, but gets really pretty much no use. So I figured this might be a good place to keep the worms until I figure out something that gives me a little bit more peace of mind in terms of leaving the worms outside. I've actually been reviewing some of the Crazy Worm Lady's older videos showing how she managed her outdoor bin all winter and somehow managed to keep the worms surviving and thriving all winter. So I figured I would just take a quick peek to see how these little guys are doing out here today. And normally here within the pumpkin itself, it's possible to see a couple worms hanging out, and that's what we see here right now. Enjoying a nice yummy pumpkin. And I wasn't really planning on rummaging around too much down in here. I was just hoping to take a peek to see how things look after a fairly cold day yesterday and another cold day today. And just to let everyone know, this is the current status of my my outdoor worm bin. I basically chickened out. But I am starting to regain some of my confidence because after reviewing the Crazy Worm Lady videos from last year, it did seem like her outdoor worm bin did quite alright, even when the top of the container had a big frozen block of ice on it and it was surrounded by snow for days. I might just be overreacting to the cold temperatures and not wanting to keep the worms outside for fear of having them freeze. So for now, they're hanging around inside my old abandoned stairwell, and we'll kind of decide on what the next steps should be in the near future. So now the other little pumpkin that the worms got that we just saw in the outdoor bin was originally attacked by the squirrels, and it actually looks like they might be eating the meaty part of the pumpkin as well. So I've been debating on making this into worm food, but as long as it looks like the squirrels are making a meal of it, I figured I might leave it out here and let them continue feasting on it if it's actually something they enjoy eating. So we'll see. This might end up as worm food, but for now I'm leaving it. Maybe the squirrels will appreciate that. And as for actual worm food, I usually like to, if you've watched my channel before, I like to freeze my food that's going to be given to the worms. And since last night was going to be a deep freeze kind of a night, I figured I would just use outside as my refrigerator to freeze some stuff that was picked out of the refrigerator that was kind of forgotten about at the bottom of the crisper. Some old lettuce, some old cucumbers, some old fruits and stuff. You can see there's quite a bit. So tried to salvage a bunch of stuff that had just been forgotten about and was sitting in the back of the refrigerator for a while. And I've got a variety of different things here. This stuff I thought I would maybe give to the outdoor bin, but you saw there was still that huge remaining pumpkin in there, and I think that's going to be plenty to keep the worms fed for a while, as well as all the leaves and other bedding that's out there. So I think they're going to be good in the outdoor bin. So I'll probably just use this stuff to feed my indoor bins. So I think it's time to head down to the wormery. Let's grab this food and go. So now, in addition to the food that we bought from outside. We've also got our normal coffee grounds, used coffee grounds. And I think we're going to begin with the Vermi bags, which are technically the oldest of my bins as far as launch date, but probably the slowest composting ones because of the population in them. Let's start with the Vermi Bag Mini. I'm treating these Vermi bags as having fairly small populations in them because these did start with, if this is, let's see, yeah, okay, these are the European night crawlers. So this started with 500 cocoons, and I really didn't get the sense that there were quite that many worms in here, at least so far. So we're gonna treat this as maybe not needing quite so much food. Although, you know, when I look through here, it does seem like most of the food that they got last time might have been consumed. Well, no, that's not true. What do we have here? Oh, this would be the piece of bread. These bins got bread a couple feedings ago, and the bread is gradually breaking down. And there's some cantaloupe rinds, avocado shell. I've been taking kind of a conservative approach to feeding these, not wanting to overfeed. This might be that other piece of bread, so I don't think we're going to be able to recognize those as pieces of bread anymore going forward. This would be a banana stem. So yeah, I'm gonna treat this bin as still having some, you know, pretty decent amount of leftovers from the last feeding. And I'm just going to give it a little bit, not too much. I'm going to try to poke around down here a little bit, though, to see how the very lowest reaches of the bin are doing, down where the exit portal would be. Since this is a flow-through system, you'd be harvesting by simply removing the castings from the very bottom. And I did make the decision a while ago to, you know, attempt to excavate stuff from the bottom of this bin occasionally, to make sure we just don't end up with a bunch of uncomposted material down there when it comes time to harvest this bin. So as you can see, I just reached down to the very bottom, and you might have even heard it. I just grabbed some of this shredded newspaper that was down there to bring it closer to the surface so that it can be combined with the food that they're going to get right now, and hopefully that'll help speed the composting of the food itself, since it's a nice combination to have the food and the bedding together, but also to eliminate or to reduce the amount of bedding and uncomposted stuff that would be at the bottom, so that at some point in the future when this bin gets harvested, we're not left with a bunch of stuff that's not castings at the bottom. So I'm not going to go too crazy feeding this bin. Out of our frozen pile of stuff from outside, there's a few lettuce leaves here, combined with a piece of paper towel, and something that I normally don't like to see too much in my bins, which is corn, simply because it takes so darn long for it to break down. But I'm anticipating that this bin's going to be in service for quite some time, so I'm not worrying about it. So that's our feeding for today. And I like the fact that there's, you know, I did sort of turn the material around a bit, but there's a worm here and there's a worm here, so there's worms all over the place. So it's not like what I'm used to seeing, because I'm used to seeing just massive amounts of worms all globbed together in huge piles right around the feeding zone in my bins. And since I'm not seeing that here, that's one of the main reasons I'm kind of leaning towards the assumption, at least, that this bin might not have quite as large a population as the rest of my bins. And, you know, hopefully they're almost at the age where they're going to start reproducing soon, and we'll start seeing baby worms as well. So, yeah. I also want to just get a sense from touching around here how the moisture level is. The moisture level situation appears to have been remedied by the additional cover that I put on here. So I had originally just had this piece of cardboard resting out here, almost suspended over the material. But then I went ahead and I added this piece of newspaper, try to keep the moisture down within the material. And then, like I said, I had this piece of cardboard, which doesn't even really rest on the material. It sort of floats out on top. But then, and then the other thing I've been doing is I've got this other piece of cardboard, pizza box, that actually sits on the top of the bin, so that the vent that the bin has is covered as well to reduce the amount of air that evaporates out of the container. So, you know, after the zipper is closed, I use the cardboard to keep this screen mesh covered to keep the amount of moisture that escapes the bin to a minimum. I had a smaller piece of cardboard on there in the past, but I figured I would try to go a little bit bigger to keep the moisture in the bin a little bit better, and it seems to be working. So, all right, let's get the other Vermi bag out here and start feeding that one too. Okay. What we have here is the Vermi Bag tote, and I have to check myself because I always forget. I can't remember if I'm calling this as a Vermi bag as I should. Sometimes I think I call it a Vermi bin, maybe. I don't know. I'm sure Tom at Vermi Bag is probably grinding his teeth every time I call the Vermi bag something else. But so the Vermi bag here, you saw that I had a piece of cardboard covering this ventilation panel as well. Try to keep the moisture in the container rather than evaporating out. And you might have also remembered I was covering up with only a piece of newspaper for a while, and now I've got this extra piece of cardboard on top as well. So the whole idea again being that I want to try to keep the moisture down within the bin, because these well ventilated bags definitely allow for the moisture to evaporate, which is terrific. I would love to have had this in the summertime when it was really humid and all my bins got rather soaked and sticky and muddy. But now that, you know, the weather's drying off and we're maybe more into the winterish weather, the air is much drier, and you could tell right away in the bins because the moisture levels are kind of coming back down to what I'm more used to. And so check that out. Okay, this answers my question. This answers my question whether these worms are mating or not. Here we see two worms connected to one another, and that's an indication that they're finally breeding. Right there on top, first worm that I saw was a worm that's connected to another worm, breeding. So these are the African night crawlers, and that would lead me to believe that the European night crawlers that were in the other Vermi bag are hopefully at that same stage in their life cycle. So that means we might be seeing some cocoons and some baby worms in the near future. That's awesome. It's a good thing to see. Just another thing that's interesting for me to see is just the size of these worms, you know, because I'm always, you know, the first time I peek into one of my nightcrawler bins, I'm always kind of taken aback by the sheer size of the worms, since I've always composted with red wigglers. To see a bunch of really big worms when I open the bin is pretty awesome, and then I have to remind myself that these are, you know, just a larger breed of worm, so it's perfectly normal that they're larger than what I'm accustomed to seeing. And I'm just poking around here a little bit just to see if what I had hoped is occurring, and it seems to be occurring, is that the just the moisture level in general seems to be improving. It's interesting, as I look through the bottom, there's a lot of sunlight streaming in, and it's quite clear to see that you can actually see the daylight poking through that material, which is uncommon for me because I usually, you know, compost in plastic containers. So it just seemed weird, like, to see, you know, light emitting from the bottom of the bin. And it's just the fabric, you know. It's letting a fair amount of light come in through the bottom. So I'm just poking around a little bit, mostly to get a sense of what the moisture level's like. But I'm also trying to get a sense of how much, you know, how much of the food that they were given previously has been consumed. And it's getting worked. It's getting worked down gradually, but there's still some signs of various things here. This has got to be that piece of cauliflower that we keep bumping into and smelling. It's got a little bit of an odor to it. I was able to tell right away when I pulled it out of the pile. And, you know, cantaloupe rinds, all kind of being worked down gradually. Um, a banana peel, here's the stem and a little bit of the peel material. So the food's getting worked down pretty good. But there's still plenty in here for, you know, to keep them going. You know, if I were to go on vacation for a month, I bet these worms would be just fine. But you know me, you know, I always like to generously feed. So we're going to give these little guys a little bit more food before we close up the container and let them get back to work. So why don't we just try to give them an, you know, an equal amount to what we gave the other nightcrawler bin. We're going to give them a couple pieces of corn, because like I said, I'm anticipating that these nightcrawler bins are going to be in service for a while, so that'll give this slow composting food some time to break down. You know, like we gave the other nightcrawler bin, we'll throw in a few hunks of lettuce for them. And I don't want to go overboard, so I think that'll be plenty for now. And one thing I forgot to give the other nightcrawler bin was coffee, so we'll give this bin a little bit of coffee, and I think that's going to be plenty. I had actually thought about maybe not feeding the nightcrawler bins, knowing that they are somewhat, you know, lesser in population than my normal red wiggler tubs. But I figured, what the heck? Let's try to be consistent. Let's try to feed these nightcrawler bins the same way I've always fed my red wiggler bins, which is with a pretty generous supply of food, always at the ready, and feeding even when it doesn't seem like it would be necessary to do so. But I like what I'm seeing here. This is pretty cool. It's nice to see that the worms are finally breeding. So I think that's going to, you know, help drive the increase in the population pretty soon too. So it's probably best that there's a fair amount of food remaining in here. I'm going to assume that grit-wise we're still okay in this bin, at least for a while. So I'm not going to be adding grit to any of my bins today. I've been pretty generous on it lately, as you might have noticed if you've been watching my channel. But I figured I would just skip doing grit today and add food only today. So, all right, good stuff happening here. Kind of fun to watch the nightcrawler bins finally, you know, get somewhere. It always felt like the nightcrawlers were just kind of creeping and making very slow progress, but I finally feel like we're getting somewhere, so good stuff. All right, let's move on. On to the red wigglers. All right, so now, in keeping with the whole idea of feeding the oldest to the newest, we're now on to the oldest of my red wiggler bins, which dates back to the 13th of September. And we're now trying to remember what today's date is. Somewhere around the same day, maybe 11th, 12th, no, 12th, 13th? Maybe it is the 13th of November, meaning we're exactly 2 months into this red wiggler bin. And, you know, 2 months is a pretty decent amount of time. And that should tell us that we're going to see some pretty good progress. And, you know, don't forget, my bins are usually populated with fairly large numbers of worms, so it's shouldn't be a surprise when you get down into the feeding zone that we find lots and lots of worms. So let's peel back, check out what the last feeding is looking like in terms of progress, and we'll just throw in a little bit of additional food to keep things going here. Here's some cardboard. And as we work our way down, working our way through a variety of different types of materials here. Oh, we're already encountering a pretty good hunk of worms hanging out over here. Down here too, I could feel quite a large mass of worms. So when I hit a mass of worms, I'm assuming I'm coming across some sort of a very savory piece of food that they've been given previously. This looks like the red potato skins, so I'm guessing that maybe it was either the potato skins or something else in this area that's drawing their attention. There's a banana peel and, or well, the banana stem, I guess, would be more accurate. What else have we here? This appears to be a hunk of that bread. Maybe, maybe not. This might be sweet potato, actually. It gets more and more difficult to tell what something was once it starts to get, you know, into that week or two old age after the worms have had a chance to work on it for a while. So here we have a coffee filter, which is in actually terrific condition if you consider it. Maybe to try to spur on some more activity, I would maybe throw a piece of savory food right into the middle of it, like whatever this is. And either the worms exiting it upon being well fed, or new worms making their way to it in the interest of joining the fun, might actually help trigger, you know, a little bit better depletion of that piece of paper. Oh, here's a lot more. Look at that. Many, many worms. All right. I'm always getting so distracted by encountering a big glob of worms that I just can't seem to help myself, and always want to play around with them. It's one of the pitfalls of having worms. Somehow you just can't resist goofing off and playing around with them. So, all right. I've got this and 2 other bins to feed still. So I'm going to try to ration out what remains of the food supply in such a way that an even amount is administered to each bin. So I'm going to start with the coffee, just so I don't forget, like I often do. I see some mold growing on the coffee, which is a good thing. And what do we have here? A little plum, piece of rotting cucumber, piece of peach. There's all kinds of stuff in here today. Piece of lettuce, some cauliflower, some carrots that have definitely seen better days. Maybe another one of these little tiny plums, and maybe just a couple more pieces of cabbage, and another little piece of lettuce. So that seems like a pretty nice varied feeding for them. Different types of yummy food. So yeah, let's cover up and work our way over to the next bin. As I like to do, you know, I'm using this as an opportunity to check the far edges away from where the feeding zones are occurring. And I got to admit, the material over here on these edges is rather dry. And I might have even talked about this last week in terms of, you know, maybe trying to do a little bit more of a mixing of the material to try to get some of the drier material closer to where the feedings are occurring, and get some of the food drenched and wet, damp material that's near the feeding zones out to the edges to try to balance out the moisture level around the bin. Maybe next time. I think we're more or less done with this bin right now. And I'm trying to be consistent, so I'm not going to do it to the other bins either. But we'll definitely scope out how things are doing from a moisture perspective in the other bins too. And then maybe we'll try to formulate that into a game plan for the next feeding, if I remember. That's always a big problem too. Remembering what the game plan was and keeping to it. Alright, let's get the next bin out here. Alright, so we're working our way from oldest to newest. So the last bin that we fed was about 2 months old. This one is dated September 30th, making it about a month and a half old, since we're now in mid-November. And as we get to the newer bins, it's evident that this is a newer bin because there's more and more leafy material on the top surface. And that's something that I usually coat the upper level of all my new bins with, is a generous supply of dry leaves. And then sometimes I'll use dry leaves as bedding, but I don't recoat the top surface because I try to use the progress of that upper surface of the material as an indicator of how things are coming along. So this just tells me that this is still a slightly newer bin than what we've seen previously because of the amount of leaves we're seeing on top. You give the worms a little bit of cover and then they just seem to go nuts right beneath that. See all this really nice fresh casting material. It's got a real nice moisture level to it. We're already starting to see some signs of the food. And I mean, you can see from how floppy this piece of cantaloupe rind is. It's like a piece of paper. It's very thin. Let's start, yeah, the castings are pretty moist. And right away you can see tons and tons of worms hanging out right beneath the material. Which I guess I expected just based on the fact that there were so many castings right there on the surface. So this bin, I guess, appears to have possibly a greater number of worms in it than the last bin did. I mean, that's just my initial impression from looking at it. You know, massive worms everywhere. Something is a little bit stinky in here. It's making me wonder what, and I wonder if it's maybe the bread. It's not a big deal, you know. I'm always putting all different types of material into these bins, and some stuff gets a little bit stinky if it takes a while for it to break down. Maybe potato. One of the bins actually got a pretty large lump of potato skins, so that it all frozen together into a big pile, and I was unable to separate it. So it did end up going as a big heap into one of the bins. And if that's the case, if there was still a whole bunch of that stuff in here, then that could account for that smell. This might be the bin that got a whole bunch of potato. Here again, very difficult to tell what some of this stuff was originally. Although this might be a piece of that bread. Just from the look of it, it looks like it could be the bread. And I'm glad to see that the bread's finally breaking down, because we were actually noticing almost full rolls in here. The rolls have been in here for a couple weeks now, but they're finally, you know, getting infiltrated. See a fair amount of worms enjoying the feast here. So, you know, I think it's usually not so much the food itself that the worms are interested in, but maybe more like the partially broken down material that the microbes leave behind once the microbes themselves infiltrate the food. So you know, it really depends on the food too, so that's not a all-inclusive cover-all sort of a statement, but I think that's pretty much the way it works in most cases. Which also supports, you know, my thinking on adding food. You know, you put some stuff in there and the worms might not be able to get right at it right away. It might take a little bit of time for the, you know, the microorganisms in the container to get a stab at the material first, break it down to the point where it's ready for the worms to consume, and then the worms can have at it. So yeah, this is definitely a hungry bin, so it might make sense to, you know, add maybe a little bit more to this one. I mean, you know, I'm down to 2 bins, so I might as well just take what's left and divvy it up evenly, 50-50. I don't remember exactly how we're doing on the other bin that we're going to feed last, although I do recall that one being launched off with a huge number of worms too, so you know, I wouldn't want to overfeed here and then be left with too little for that bin. I think we'll just keep it fair and we'll go 50-50. Give half of what's left to this bin and give the other half to the other bin. So, you know, trying to keep it equitable. So we'll put cucumber, cabbage, there's a peach, looks pretty nasty. See, I pulled the peach pit out as well as the seed that was in all these plums. I didn't want to have to go fishing around peach pits and plum pits and have all kinds of stuff like that in the bin. So I did, you know, choose to extract all of those before putting this stuff outside to freeze overnight. So, you know, some people might choose to go ahead and give it all to the worms, and maybe the worms will eventually break it down over time. But I opted to not do that, so that's just that's just your choice in the end if you're doing something similar at home. This doesn't necessarily intend to show anyone how to do it. It's just the way I do it. So that's a pretty nice, generous feeding, I think, leaving enough for the next bin as well. So let's get these little guys covered up and back up on the shelf and finish off with the last group, the last red wiggler bin that still needs to be fed. As far as the material on the edge of this bin, though, it doesn't seem quite as dry, and I think that's something that I probably could have forecasted from the very beginning when I dug into the feeding zone of this bin. This bin is pretty highly populated. It was pretty damp relative to the other red wiggler bin we fed first, and I guess I probably could have anticipated that the moisture level on the edges of this one wouldn't be quite as dry as what we saw in the last bin. Although I wouldn't say it's, you know, damp or ideal. It probably would benefit from a little turning as well. Alright, pretty good. Alright, we got one last bin to feed. It's the newest of my bins. Let's go grab that one and polish off what remains of the food. Alright, so now considering this is the newest of my bins, it's got some pretty good weight to it. Usually my newest bins are pretty light because they're still, you know, full of material that's somewhat dry and haven't had as many feedings, so haven't had as much material added to them over time. So that's kind of cool. Usually the new light bins are almost like a feather to lift compared to the older bins that are already getting so densely populated and full of castings and, you know, ever increasing amount of material being added and converted into castings over time. I believe it was this bin here, if I'm not mistaken. This is the bin that we actually pulled a whole bunch of volunteer worms out of, because it was not long ago, maybe 4 days ago, that I launched off the newest of my time-lapse videos. And I guess if you're interested, I'll put a link up in the corner of the screen to the setup of that bin, if you're in something you might be interested in seeing. So I did pull out, you know, a bunch of worms, but it was only because I recalled this bin as having a fairly large population, and that, you know, taking a bunch of volunteers out of here shouldn't dent the numbers too much, you know, overall. So I guess we'll see what we see when we get down into the feeding zone. The feeding zone is usually a pretty good telltale of how many worms are present in the bin. But I'm already seeing a pretty fair number of them on the outer edges of the feeding zone. Yeah, got pretty good numbers in here. There's also a pretty good amount of the remaining food in here too. Here, I believe this is one of the, just based on the amount of mold on it, I'm assuming that this is probably one of the rolls. And it almost looks like dough at this point. It's just getting pretty nasty as all the moisture makes its way into it. So hopefully that'll be gone soon too. But yeah, there's, you know, considering I did do an extraction of worms, I believe, out of this bin, there do seem to be a fair number of worms hanging out down here enjoying the food that they got last time. So I'm glad we didn't, you know, overfeed the last bin and shortchange this one, because I think this bin is also going to benefit from a good generous feeding as well. I believe over here we're going to find the other roll. This is actually cantaloupe rind, but these little scraps here, I believe, are what remains of the last roll. I had thrown 2 rolls into each of these bins to see how they degrade over time, and originally after the first check-in it seemed like it, you know, was taking quite a while for them to break down, but it looks like the worms are finally getting into it and enjoying it, so I'm glad to see that. This looks like a banana peel, just tore apart under its own weight from me lifting it. So it's on its road to being transformed into compost as well. These were, I think, prunes or something like that. I can't remember. Yeah, there's definitely something making a little bit of a stinky odor in here. And it could just be cabbage or cauliflower or one of those sort of veggies that makes kind of a stink. Potato makes a little bit of a stink if it sits for a long time, doesn't get consumed right away. So yeah, I don't want to play around in here too much longer because the scent is a little bit unpleasant. But it's not, to me, it's not a warning sign of anything going wrong. I think it's just an indication of, you know, the fact that there had been a certain type of food placed in here, which is still in the process of being broken down. So I'm certain that it'll dissipate and get consumed, and the worms will be completely happy to eat it. This looks like it might have been one of those prunes or plums that got thrown in here without the seed being extracted. It's hard as a rock, but I'm going to leave it in there, and we'll just keep checking in on it, I guess, as we stumble on it. We'll see if it makes any progress. Hopefully it will. So let's knock the remainder of the coffee that's in this carton out. There's a little bit of a bottom layer, and then we don't have to pick through the remainder of the food. We can just do a quick dump of it to throw everything that remains into the feeding zone here. So why don't we try to get a sense of what it is we're talking about here. We got another peach, it looks like. Some more cabbage stem. Another carrot that's seen finer days. More cukes. Another carrot. What have we here? Did I have a change of heart on this peach? Maybe I did. Maybe I started into the extraction of this last peach pit, and then I might have thought the same thing. That maybe it would just be interesting to leave it be and see, you know, what it takes for it to get broken down. So I guess this is the this might end up being the pit bin, the bin that's got some fruits in it that went in here with pits, so we can try to observe how the pits get broken down over time. All right, pretty good. Alrighty, let's start getting this thing covered up and back up on the shelf. Okay. So, you know, this being the newest of my bins, you would expect it to be covered in fairly fresh leaf cover. So we'll try to restore that appearance as best we can. Although I think I may have actually inadvertently given this bin a little bit more of a shuffle than I normally would. And it's not a big deal. It's not an exact science. Just do what you can and hope for the best. But I think we can almost expect the best, because things really do look good in these bins. So I'm very happy to see how things are progressing. I'm also very happy to see that the high moisture levels that I was observing all summer long and the humid months have kind of gone away, and I'm not dealing with any of that sticky, muddy compost that you normally see in this you know, sticky, humid days of summer. This is really much more like what I like to see in my worm bins. So I'm just going to continue cleaning up here, get this thing covered and back up on the shelf, but I'm not going to keep you around for that. That's boring. I just wanted to say thanks for watching, and I appreciate your company. So definitely tune in again next time, and also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel. That's always really appreciated as well. You know, there's all kinds of interesting stuff to see on my channel, so I invite you to go look around and see if you find any other interesting material, and if you do, then definitely consider becoming a subscriber. So hopefully we'll see you back here again next time. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.